Welcome. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. Today we'll talk about Saturn in Aquarius and the major trends that this represents. If you hadn't yet seen my earlier video about the transition of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction into air signs, I recommend that you view it. You can certainly see it first or second, but it's best viewed in conjunction, no pun intended, with this particular video. I wanted to say thank you to all of my patrons who have been supporting me for months and in some cases years, so I really appreciate all of your encouragement and your kind words. If you would like to become a patron and get access to these videos early, and in some cases to get access to videos that are only available to patrons, please visit patreon.com/Nina Griffin. So today, Saturn in Aquarius. Just to put this in context, we have 3, or if you would like 4, major astrological cycles starting in December 2020. That's right, it's a historical moment, astrologically speaking. Jupiter and Saturn are really kind of the main focus. Because they're the slowest of all the visible planets, their interactions really determine long eras, and their symbolism sticks around for a long time. So their longest cycle traditionally has been when they conjoin precisely at 0 degrees Aries, because that starts a super long cycle. But this actually hasn't happened for at least 2,500 years, and my ephemeris doesn't go back far enough to actually determine the last time that this occurred. So clearly we're looking at a multi-thousand-year cycle. Now, their second longest cycle is when their conjunction shifts into a new element or triplicity for 240 years, which is the subject of my prior video. And this is something I really like to emphasize to people because it's such a unique and historic moment. Most people never have the opportunity to live through this kind of triplicity shift. Obviously, it's, unsettling, maybe a little bit scary, but at the same time, it's a really unique and cool period to be living through because most people never get to experience that shift. So today we'll talk about a smaller cycle, relatively speaking, and this is Saturn ingressing into a new sign where he usually spends about 2.5 years. So obviously this already started a little bit in 2020, but if you're interested in learning more about Saturn in Aquarius and how his influences will likely determine our lives for the next few years, I recommend you visit ninagriffin.com, and there is a blog post, quite extensive, a very long article I wrote earlier this year about Saturn in Aquarius that develops some of the ideas I'll mention today. So again, because the next cycle is going to be in air, the next Jupiter-Saturn conjunction cycle, Saturn's entry into Aquarius acts as a little bit of a preview of the kinds of things that we can expect for the next couple of centuries. So my recommendation for everyone in December is to really pay attention to what happens, because a lot of these ideas and trends and concerns that we're dealing with now are ones that will be with us, hopefully resolved positively for humanity, but they will be with us for the next couple of 100 years. Now, as I mentioned earlier, December, Jupiter also enters a new sign, Aquarius, as well, and he will spend 1 year there. So that is the shortest cycle that we're embarking upon. And this will be covered in my next video. So if you're interested in that, keep an eye out for it as well. So Saturn in Aquarius. Saturn takes 29.5 years to move through all 12 signs of the zodiac, spending about 2.5 years in each of the signs. Now, Saturn was last in Aquarius in the early 1990s, and I wanted to spend a little time talking about the similarities between that time and now. I think you'll find that when you look at what was going on then and what's happening now, many of the same issues are sort of coming back up to be resolved or revisited. It's kind of amazing how 30 years can seem like a blink of an eye when these Saturn themes come around again. So for this upcoming transit, here are the key dates. So Saturn was in Aquarius starting March 21st, 2020, and he was there until July 1st, 2020. He then retrograded back into Capricorn for the last sort of fling, and he will be moving into Aquarius for good December 16th, 2020, and will stay there until March 7th, 2023, at which point he will move on into Pisces. Now, let's talk about some of the kind of key high-level significations of Saturn in Aquarius. Now, I've come to the belief that to really understand Saturn in Aquarius, we really have to think of it as part of a pair of bookends, where Saturn is first in its nocturnal sign, Capricorn, and then he moves into his diurnal sign, Aquarius. Now, by traditional rulership, Saturn is the only planet who rules adjacent signs. So when you think about it, Jupiter has, of course, 2 signs of rulership, so does Mars, Venus, Mercury. However, none of those signs are adjacent. Saturn is the only one where when he's in his one sign of rulership, he will be passing into his next sign of rulership, or he has just passed through it. So we always get 5 years total of Saturn passing through his domicile at the same time. Now, what I think that means is that we can look at Saturn as the start of a cycle in Capricorn and the end of a cycle in Aquarius. Now, in my article that you can read online, I developed this theme a little bit, and I'll talk about it here as well. Saturn is considered happier in Aquarius than in Capricorn, even though he rules them both. And the reason for that is that Saturn is a diurnal planet. And diurnal planets are happier in diurnal or so-called masculine signs. So Saturn is happier in Aquarius because Aquarius is a diurnal sign. He is slightly less happy in Capricorn, which is a nocturnal or feminine or yin sign. So it doesn't mean necessarily that he's going to be better exactly. I mean, Saturn is still Saturn, but it does mean that he has some extra commonality with Aquarius, and maybe he can be seen to be a little bit more constructive in that sign. So in my article, I used the Latin alchemical motto, solve et coagula, to describe that 5-year process that Saturn goes through when he transits Capricorn and then Aquarius. This motto means dissolve, then solidify. And it's kind of a mysterious motto because it can be applied to the chemical process, which the alchemists were said to use to turn lead into gold. But of course, it can also be used from a spiritual perspective to dissolve, for example, the ego or the things that hold us down, and then to solidify or rebuild those parts into a new and better whole. Obviously, this can be viewed in a very material as well as in a spiritual sense. The main point of this motto, though, is that you break things down to their basic components in order to rebuild them better next time, which is really the 5-year Saturn process. So if you think about it, we have just passed through the first part of that process, through to the dissolution, and we are now moving into the solidification or rebuilding part of it. So again, Saturn in Capricorn, being a nocturnal or yin sign, is all about Saturn's ability to break down things and just act as what I call the great decomposer. If you remember from your biology class, decomposers are those organisms that make sure that dead organisms are broken down to their tiniest components, and their parts can then be recycled to be made into new living plants and animals and all kinds of organic matter. So this first part of the process, I call it the liberation of matter from the prison of form, which I know sounds a little bit dramatic, but that's really what it is. You're basically just liberating these individual components so they can be recycled and reused into something new, better, and more appropriate or more alive. Now note that Capricorn is a cardinal sign, and this always suggests movement and activity and instability. Right? Cardinal signs are not about creating stability, they're about creating movement. And so when you take a structure and you introduce movements, well, one way you can do that is you apply a wrecking ball. It's definitely moving now, right? So as we've just all experienced, Saturn passing through Capricorn in many ways is about the old ways being discarded and everything breaking down to their most basic parts so that they can be hopefully reassembled into something better. Another way to think about it is like buildings being knocked down and their bricks are reused for other or new buildings. So again, that was Saturn in Capricorn, not necessarily a pleasant experience, right? So then what does Saturn in Aquarius mean? So Saturn is going to be in Aquarius, which is a diurnal or yang or masculine sign. And this being a fixed sign encourages building things up from those disassembled parts that were provided by Saturn in Capricorn. So obviously, because it's a fixed signs are the stabilizing modality, right? So if cardinal signs are all about introducing motion and movement and instability, the fixed signs are then trying to restore some kind of stability, some kind of homeostasis to systems in order to create some kind of way forward that is a little bit more stable. So when we're talking about the destruction of old forms, Aquarius and the other fixed signs are really all about the building up of new forms, giving things a new shape. So in other words, Saturn's passage through Aquarius is going to introduce and encourage the creation of new forms with the building materials that are recycled from the old stuff that was outworn or just simply dead. Now, I understand all of this is quite abstract, but it can be understood on a personal as well as a societal level. And I will be doing a future video on Saturn's passage through the 12 houses so that you understand what it means in your particular chart. For now, though, I want you to just start thinking about the Saturn and Aquarius dynamic. In other words, this is the part of our lives that we're all asked to rebuild and reimagine some new way of existing that will fit the future better than our old way of doing things. So some of the specific Saturn and Aquarius opportunities have a lot to do with the fact that Aquarius is one of the so-called humane signs, which are really just the air signs. They all represent the human race, as well as birds, by the way, compared to, say, the water signs, which traditionally would, of course, represent like aquatic animals like fish and so forth. So whenever you have Saturn passing through the humane signs, the focus will be on events and trends that affect large numbers of people. I mean, obviously, astrology is very human-centric anyway, but this is really about movements that shift the way that people normally do things, sometimes in good ways, sometimes in bad. But the signs that are humane always represent changes occurring primarily in the realm of humanity. One of the wonderful things about the humane signs is that they always provide an opportunity for the rediscovery of the greatness of the human spirit. So all of those qualities like courage and ingenuity and humanitarianism become more important, and people become more aware of them and start talking about them, and these ideas start entering the public discourse a little bit more. Now, because Aquarius is one of what I would call the builder or fixed signs, I think of this as a time when new social and political structures emerge. So I think we're going to see a lot of that in the next couple of years, obviously longer than just 2 years because we're entering these big new cycles. But we're certainly going to see the beginnings, the little baby shoots, the baby plants of these new structures coming up. So again, the focus will be on human values, humanitarianism, education, and technology, all of which are very air sign related. In particular, I think people will focus on the use of ingenuity and the mind to improve everyone's lives. Now, one of the things that's very interesting and that I think is very accurate for us right now is that whenever the air signs start becoming dominant, so when Saturn is in an air sign, when Jupiter and Saturn shift into air signs by triplicity and so forth, epidemics that affect primarily humans become very important. Now, obviously, that is happening already, even though Jupiter and Saturn have not yet entered an air sign, but obviously we're going to be dealing with that once they do. So epidemics always bring about some level of societal change, but, and I think this is especially true in the 20th and 21st centuries, they also bring about new technologies. They accelerate scientific process, the scientific process of invention and just general progress, but they do so through suffering, right? That's a very Saturnian thing. The nice thing is that because we're also simultaneously for the first year going to have Jupiter passing through Aquarius, that progress I think will also be very hopeful and joyous, at least some of the time. But primarily when you have Saturn passing through one of these humane signs, yes, all of these values in humanitarianism and science are advanced, but they are advanced because somebody else was suffering in order to cure or in order to help people who are having some kind of problems. Now again, because the air signs also impact aerial animals, specifically birds, there could be some kind of impacts to birds as well. I haven't yet known what that would be, but it's just something we want to keep an eye out for. Now, there are countries that traditionally are associated with Aquarius, and keep an eye out for activity here, both social and political, as well as cultural. So all the cities and regions and countries of Aquarius are going to be especially sensitized by Saturn's passage through their signs. It could be the next couple of years, they could be experiencing what I would consider a especially transformative and potentially challenging period in their histories. The number one Aquarius country historically has been Russia, but also Denmark, lower or southern Sweden, Central Asia, northern Iran, Arabia, Croatia, southern Romania, and parts of Germany. Historically, that was Westphalia, Hamburg, Bremen, and Ingolstadt. So these are all areas, at least in the West, that could be experiencing some changes, and they could be in the news more than usual. Now let's talk a little bit more about the prior Saturn and Aquarius trends. So most recently, Saturn was in Aquarius in 1991 through 1993. And probably the biggest news at that time were all the former communist Eastern Bloc countries where communism ended after the 1989 revolution. And in 1991 through 93, they all moved toward free market systems and emancipated themselves politically and financially from the Soviet Union. At this time also, Soviet troops began withdrawing from Eastern Europe, where they had their various stations for the previous 40 years. Now remember that Aquarius rules Russia. So as Saturn was transiting Aquarius last time, this was a period of retreat for Russia's influence in Europe. So we will keep an eye out for that to see how that will play out this time. Now, before 1991 ended, in fact, the USSR dissolved and was renamed the Russian Federation. Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR. So I do wonder if we'll be seeing the start of a new realignment in Russia that will actually culminate in a few years' time when Saturn and Neptune conjoin in 2026. That's a whole different video, but historically, whenever Saturn and Neptune conjoined, Russia or the Soviet Union, whichever it was at the time, always experienced a major shift and a major change in direction. In addition, last time that Saturn was in Aquarius, the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic was declared, which led to years of fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and ultimately they reached a ceasefire in 1994. So the conflict we are seeing there today in 2020 is really a restart of old hostilities, and I think it could be particularly intense while Saturn transits Aquarius. The other big thing that happened in 1991 through 93 is that apartheid in South Africa ended through a long series of negotiations that lasted several years, mainly during the Saturn in Aquarius period. So you can see that as Saturn goes through Aquarius, it's not necessarily a fun or easy process, but there is a strong trend of restructuring inhumane or repressive regimes and arrangements of all kinds. In addition, at the time, the U.S. population elected a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, after 12 years of Republican presidents, and NAFTA was signed at the time. So this was really, in a larger sense, the U.S. trying to reinvent themselves politically and economically after the 1980s. And on top of all of this, what an eventful period this was. China accelerated its market reforms to become more of a market economy and more competitive economically in the world. As we all know, that's been paying major dividends for them for quite a while. So really the Saturn passing through Aquarius period was an opportunity for China to rethink how they do business, how they do money, how they do their economy. And it was a dramatic shift for them. It didn't happen overnight, but it really was accelerated during the Saturn in Aquarius period. Now, obviously, China is not one of the traditionally assigned Aquarius countries because the Western astrologers of the Middle Ages were not thinking about China. But if we look at the chart of China's republic, it has Aquarius rising with the moon in Aquarius actually near the ascendant. So I think that whenever we're going to have Saturn transits through Aquarius, like now, I would expect major changes in China during this period that could very well be economic in nature, just as we saw last time. Next, I wanted to talk about some of the key events for Saturn while it passes through Aquarius for the next couple of years. So, as I mentioned, Jupiter will conjoin Saturn at 0 Aquarius December 21st, 2020. So circle that date on your calendar. And this is such a potent moment of transition because, again, we're transitioning into this new air triplicity era, right? But it also encompasses the conjunction of the next 20 years, the Saturn cycle of the next couple of years, and then the Jupiter cycle of the next 1 year. So whatever happens around this date, around December 21st, will be symbolically significant for a very long time. I'm talking hundreds of years. So keep your eyes peeled, make notes. I think this is something that these issues will keep coming up in different ways around the world for a very long time to come. Now, more close to home, the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn impacts both the year leading up to the exact aspect as well as the year following. So really both 2020 and 2021. The two most common impacts associated with Jupiter conjoining Saturn are a higher than usual mortality rate. I think we definitely have that. And also economic recession, usually with some degree of stock market malaise. The one thing that makes the economy and the market a little bit less than what I would consider a total disaster in 2021 is the presence of the North Node in Gemini, which historically has been helpful to the US economy and to our equities markets. So it's not going to be fantastic, but I do think that that North Node placement will help mitigate some of the worst damage. Now, in 2021, you may already be aware of this if you're an outer planet watcher, Saturn in Aquarius will square Uranus in Taurus in February, June, and December 2021. Once we get closer to those dates, I'll be putting out a video on just this aspect, but I wanted to give you a preview and just to contextualize this aspect in light of what I've just been talking about with Saturn and Aquarius as a whole. So maybe you're familiar with the French mundane astrologer André Barbeau. He calls this combination of Saturn and Uranus dry, hard, taut, neither hot nor cold, enlisting ambition, a thirst for conquest, extremist aspirations, ventures that go to the limits, authoritarian power, the longest and most lasting reign. So, according to him, the conjunctions represent periods when, and I'm quoting here, the competing interest of the great powers were at their height. So the most recent conjunction was in 1988, so just before the end of the Cold War, and before that in 1942 during World War II. So whenever we have a square or, anything other than a conjunction, that's also a hard aspect, we can basically expect that we are going to see some kind of conflict between the great powers of the world. So we're going to see a lot of, usually that, of course, in the last few decades that's involved the United States, Russia, and China, but also many of the other important powers around the world. Rick Tarnas in Cosmos and Psyche, or actually in a follow-up article that he wrote, he says this about the Saturn-Uranus opposition 2007 through 2011. He gives it a very wide orb. We're not going to deal with this for quite that long, but nonetheless, he says that this combination, generally Saturn and Uranus, indicates sudden unexpected problematic events, crises, and schisms, a taut conflict between the conservative and liberal or progressive, the reactionary and the radical, authority and rebellion, stability and disruption, change and the resistance to change, freedom and repression, the old and the young, highly polarized societies and politics, protests, strikes, crackdowns, civil unrest. He sees it as part of the cycle of extreme liberty followed by extreme crackdown. He also notes that the 2008 presidential election occurred exactly on a Saturn-Uranus opposition, so it seems appropriate that in 2021 we are going to be dealing again with some of the same issues that were raised way back in 2008. He says that this is more likely to be an extreme change from a very conservative approach to a very liberal one, right? So kind of a whiplash effect, if you will. He thinks that this square essentially brings about generational and class conflict. He says that this time brings the possibility of highly consequential mistakes and flaws, as well as transportation accidents and actually the economic and derivative meltdown that led to the basically tanking of the global economy in 2009. He sees that as all part of the Saturn-Uranus cycle. Now, in 2021, within a month of each of those Saturn-Uranus squares in February, June, and December, Mars will also make a hard aspect to Uranus. So Mars will conjoin Uranus in January, he squares Uranus in July, and he will oppose Uranus in November 2021. So he will, and each time he does this, he will trigger almost exactly the same degree that Saturn hits. So I think we are definitely going to see tensions and engagement of some sort between the great powers of the world around these months. Now, I think that my expectation, at least, is that the Saturn square Uranus will represent peaks in the COVID-19 cases. This was actually exactly the case in the 1918 influenza epidemic, so-called Spanish flu, when Saturn opposed Uranus 5 times starting in 1918. Those poor people. Basically, this opposition lasted from 1918, October, until the middle of 1920. So they literally had almost 2 years of Saturn-Uranus oppositions. In comparison, in 2021, we'll be very fortunate in that we'll just have 3 oppositions that are done in less than 1 year's time. So whenever you think about how terrible things are, remember, it could be worse because it has been worse. All right, well, on that cheerful note, thank you for watching. I'm Nina Griffin, and be sure to check out the other videos in this series. Take care.